The final chapter on JFK. Chapter 3, Segment 3, LBJ, Economic Motives.
With the exception of teaching school for 1 year, Lyndon Johnson's entire adult life was politics. And Johnson learned at a relatively young age as an aide to someone that money is power, and money can lead to more power, and more power can lead to more money. Lyndon Johnson, for the 10 years before he became our country's vice president, was the bag man for Texas interests. He would take money and bring it up to Washington and spread it around. He also would do any deal for anyone as long as there was money available for him and his friends. With Lyndon Johnson's position as vice president, he no longer was a Senate Majority Leader where he could pass items out, pass appropriation bills, demand that other senators vote in a certain way, help lobbyists. So he was not making the same type of money he was doing before, and his Texas benefactors who were giving Johnson money before this weren't getting the returns that they used to get. When he became Kennedy's vice president, Kennedy only gave him one political appointment. So Johnson had nothing to trade. And that political appointment, we've already talked about briefly, were the TFX airplane scandal and the billions of dollars involved erupted in Johnson's face the month before Kennedy's death. With Johnson having very little power when he was a vice president, if he was out, completely out, kicked out, impeached, jailed, all of those years of Johnson's effort and the money given to him by his benefactors to help them expand their interests would be gone. Lyndon Johnson amassed huge wealth during his 65 years on Earth, and he did it all from a government employee's salary. Now, one of the ways that Johnson got his wealth, and in a large amount, was through the federal government. His good friend and supporter, Congressman Sam Rayburn, had a nephew who was one of the commissioners of the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. Well, that commission grants or revokes communication licenses within the United States. What he used is that commission to go into various radio and television businesses and to either shut the business down for some type of federal communications violation or to threaten to shut them down. And of course, Johnson would get word of this and would swoop in and buy the station or broadcasting network for pennies on the dollar. He did this across the state of Texas. Lyndon Johnson had a monopoly or something close to it for decades for his radio stations and television stations in the Austin area. That, of course, amounted and produced huge amounts of revenue for Johnson and his family. Beyond acquiring that wealth is he would take money from Texas interests, specifically oil, natural gas, and he would take that money and pass it around up in Washington to help those entities advance their interests. Johnson, of course, took a handling fee. And in a similar practice, starting with Johnson's time as a congressman and going all the way up through his time as Senate Majority Leader, Johnson had a very close relationship with a contracting company at the time known as Brown and Root, and it has now subsequently been acquired by another company, but he would pass and get government contracts to this organization, and they kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Roads, Johnson Space Center, airports, federal buildings, whatever it was, Brown and Root was there. Johnson was responsible for the contracts, and they grew and grew in power together. Unfortunately, there were suspicions that Johnson was getting paid off, and there were reports that he received on one transaction up to $500,000. So the government, the federal government, came in. They tried to audit Brown and Root, their books, to look for the money. They were rebuffed the first time. And the second time, they were ordered to produce their records. And just like Ballot Box 13, which we're going to go over, Brown and Root followed a similar practice, and that is they took all of their financial records relating to Lyndon Johnson and any corruption between the two of them. They took it out of their building and they put it in a nice, neat place, which was a little wooden shed. It was probably safer there. Tragically, the shed started on fire and all the documents were burned up, and the federal regulators had nothing to investigate. By amassing his wealth, Lyndon Johnson acquired ranches, homes, huge tracts of land in Mexico. Who knows what else he had, but it is known that he had 2 planes, along with very many other items. In a situation where you no longer have the same power you did as the Senate Majority Leader, and you can't offer your friends and benefactors the same rewards that they were getting when they were using you when you were the Senate Majority Leader, there is an economic incentive for both yourself and for your benefactors to also get more by getting rid of the thing in the way. And that was John F. Kennedy. If Kennedy was out of the picture, Johnson steps up, and there are billions for Johnson and his friends. That should be enough motive for any person, even if they're extremely moral. But beyond that, there was one more motive that Johnson had, and this related to one benefactor, the benefactor that allowed him to become the vice president under Kennedy. And that was a secret with that benefactor and Kennedy that was kept quiet. And at least one person took that secret to their grave. And when that relationship was ending, not by the choice of Johnson and the benefactor, that in itself was sufficient motive for Johnson, the benefactor, or anyone in that position to want to see Kennedy dead. We are going to discuss in later chapters the benefactor and their relationship with Johnson, and how this in and of itself was sufficient to create a prime suspect with motive, opportunity, and means, just on that item alone. In conclusion, Lyndon Baines Johnson, as the succeeding president to John F. Kennedy, had personal motives, had political motives, had economic motives, and even a secret motive for wanting Kennedy dead. He had more motives than Lee Harvey Oswald, who didn't have any discernible ones, or any of the other suspects that we've already talked about up until this point in time. So with that said, I believe that we can conclude that Lyndon Johnson should at least be considered a prime suspect and investigated by our team, looking at motive, opportunity, means, timing, plus control. See you in the next segment.